Good day. The last couple of days, we have seen what is increasingly looking like a growing disillusionment in the West, or at least in parts of the West, at the changing situation in Ukraine, in the situation in Ukraine, with Western leaders starting perhaps to think about a possible way out of what is looking like an impossible situation for themselves. At the same time, we see the Russians becoming increasingly confident. We've had discussions at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, where, as far as I can see, Russian officials are arguing not about how to deal with a escalating crisis, but how to deal with an unexpected success of their measures to counter the sanctions. In particular, there seems to be an ongoing argument there about whether a strengthening ruble, and the ruble is continuing to strengthen as I'm speaking, whether a strengthening ruble is a good thing or a bad thing, with some worried that it might lead to higher import penetration, others not so concerned. I'm not going to deal with that discussion in this program. But anyway, as the West engages in what look like increasing soul-searching and recriminations, and the Russians and the Chinese, as I'm going to discuss more fully in this program, start looking to future plans, I suppose I should start briefly with a very brief overview of the military situation in Ukraine itself. Now, the pattern of the Donbass war is that the Russians rain down heavy artillery on fortified Ukrainian positions. These Ukrainian positions eventually break. Russian infantry is then sent in. The positions are captured. Consolidation takes place. There's usually some further advances by armored forces until the next set of Ukrainian defenses is reached, and the pattern then repeats itself. So it's very much a case of incremental advances, and we see fairly rapid movement over what, by the way, are quite long distances. One of the confusing things about the Ukrainian war is that people take Donbass in isolation and then look at the pictures of Ukraine, and because Donbass is only a part of Ukraine, the distances that the forces in Donbass are moving across appear small against the backdrop of Ukraine itself. Ukraine, however, is the second biggest country in Europe. The biggest country is in fact Russia. And in fact, distances which on a map of Ukraine might look quite small can in some cases amount to tens of kilometers. So some of these Russian advances may look relatively small, but in practice, on the ground, they may actually be considerably greater. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. But for the moment, as I said, it's a case of advance until you reach a fortified line, work your artillery and your infantry until you've broken that line, break that line, then move on to the next one. And that's going to continue right through the fighting in Ukraine, in Donbass, because in Donbass, I should say, it's now clear that the Ukrainians have spent the last 8 years building layered defenses, very heavy layered defenses, but it seems that there is nothing analogous to this in the rest of Ukraine. So once all of these defense lines in Donbass are broken, and I should say each defense line that the Russians now reach is weaker than the one which preceded it, but once these layered defense lines are broken, and the Russians have broken through and taken control of the entirety of Donbass, the fighting will probably start to, the speed of advances will probably start to accelerate, with the Russians being able to launch the armoured advances that they have not engaged in now for some time. Now, whilst on that topic, I would also say that there's now been some discussion of a point which I touched on earlier in in an earlier video which I made some time ago, specifically by Larry Elliott. He's discussed this on his site in a recent article which he's published. Larry Elliott makes the point that a lot of the fighting at the moment in Donbass is still being carried out by the Donbass militia, by the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic militias. And they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the infantry fighting when the places themselves, these fortified places, are captured. The Russians provide massive artillery support, massive air support, intelligence, all of those things, logistic support, all of those things. But the main armoured forces, the big Russian armoured forces, are being held back until all of these fortified lines are broken. Now, what that means, whether the Russians will advance, how far the Russians will advance, it's not clear how far the Russians intend to go. But I would simply say that the discussions which are taking place at Spieth with various Russian officials there clearly point to advances well beyond Donbass. And the leaders of the two breakaway republics, especially Denis Pushilin, who is the leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, they're making it very clear that there will be extensive advances way beyond Donbass, because frankly that's the only way that this war can be brought to an end. Negotiations with Kiev being essentially for the moment at a standstill, and with the Russians very skeptical about any possible deals that might be made with Ukraine. And of course Pushilin has already made it fairly clear that eventually the Russians do intend to take Odessa, creating this land bridge all the way from Russia itself to Transnistria, which borders, of course, on Moldova. So this is a war where, as I said, it's attrition war in Donbass. It's probably going to continue like that for several more weeks. Perhaps by the end of the summer, we'll start to see the situation change with the various defense lines broken. And then at that point, with the ground hardening as winter approaches, the armoured forces could be sent into battle. Well, we'll have to wait and see how things turn out. Now, I'm going to quickly add that there's actually been a fair amount of information from the actual battlefronts. All kinds of places have been captured by the Russians over the last few hours, mostly places I've never heard of. I'm not an expert on the geography of Donbass. I'm not going to discuss those in detail. But perhaps the most important fact is that there are uncorroborated reports that at least some of the Ukrainian troops in the Azot chemical works in Severodonetsk have started to surrender. That's probably not the totality of the force there, which is now being recalculated upwards to 2,500 men. This is from the original guesstimates of a couple of hundred. It's now been pushed up to around 2,500. That may or may not be true, but there are at least some reports now that some of these troops are starting to come out and surrender. I can't confirm it. It may be wrong. We've seen reports like that in previous cases at the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, where there were claims of surrenders by Ukrainian troops which were premature. We'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, in the meantime, we've had two interesting diplomatic initiatives. Diplomatic Initiative 1 is the one of the three leaders of the big European countries, Germany, France, and Italy, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, and Mario Draghi. They've just been on a trip to Kiev, where they've had meetings with President Zelensky and some of his officials. And I have to say, there's some photographs which have appeared, which show Macron and Scholz and Draghi dressed in suits and ties and looking dapper, as they always do. And the Ukrainians look quite astonishingly dishevelled in what I suppose is the sort of look that they're now projecting to give the impression that, they're a country in battle. I have to say that to me, it looks rather seedy. The look looks rather seedy, but okay, others no doubt will have a different view. Now, we've heard a great deal of talk about what these three leaders came to Kiev to do. One of the most interesting things is apparently there was no discussion about further arms deliveries to Ukraine, which is really very interesting. The United States has announced more arms deliveries to Ukraine, but as I've discussed in a recent program, the 18 M777 howitzers that are in the latest armed package is a drop in the ocean and derisory compared to Ukraine's other demands. And I have to say that there's already some suggestions that it doesn't cover the number of M777 howitzers that the Russians have already destroyed or captured. So it looks as if this is not a particularly impressive arms package, whilst a briefing by the Pentagon about the Harpoon deliveries was, I have to say, deeply demoralizing if you are a Ukrainian, or at least I would have thought so, because apparently the United States has agreed to Ukrainian demands to supply Ukraine with a small amount of Harpoon anti-ship missiles, presumably to defend Odessa. But it seems that these missiles have to be adapted to be carried on a truck chassis, and there has to be an enormous amount of work done to develop this truck chassis and to install all the relevant electronics and to adapt the system in that kind of a way. And from the way the Pentagon briefing was going, it seemed this process might take months. And I've actually heard even one suggestion that the whole process could take a whole year before a properly operational system was ready to provide to Ukraine. I have to say, this seems astonishing, but apparently that is the reality, and cutting corners in developing a system like this apparently risks providing Ukraine with an operational system that actually wouldn't work very effectively. So this story of the Harpoon missiles that are going to be delivered to Ukraine, for the moment, I'm not a technical person, and this may change, but for the moment, and based on what the Pentagon was saying, well, that doesn't look very impressive. Anyway, that's where we are. Let's go back to the visit of the three European leaders. They were not talking about arms deliveries. They were talking about Ukraine's entry into the European Union, and they all support granting Ukraine candidate status to join the European Union. But then, of course, comes immediately the caveat, which is that Ukraine must carry out extensive reforms before it can join the European Union. Now, that is what the same European leaders, what the European Commission, what all the major countries in the European Union have been saying for years. So what does the candidate status that is now going to be granted to Ukraine actually change? It changes nothing. All European leaders appear to concede that this process of Ukraine joining the European Union will take years. It might even take decades. And Ukraine has to carry out reforms which it's been urged to carry out, and which it has consistently proved incapable of carrying out. I'm going to say that this is, for me, another cruel trick which has been played on Ukraine. It reminds me of the disastrous decision at the NATO summit meeting in Budapest in 2008 to say that Ukraine would one day join NATO without providing Ukraine with any particular date when that would happen, and without providing Ukraine with any real commitment to it joining NATO. And as we've seen, that aroused and provoked the Russians. It set the scene for the war that is actually taking place now. But it was also clear that this was a commitment which some of the NATO member states never intended to implement. And it looks to me that this is exactly the same thing that's happening with this decision to grant Ukraine candidate membership status for the European Union. It's a way of appearing to agree that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union without actually having any real intention to bring Ukraine into the European Union. By the way, French officials have also said that in order for Ukraine to join the European Union, the war in Ukraine must end, and that of course gives the Russians an incentive to continue the war, a further incentive to continue the war until victory. I don't really understand the purpose of these three Western leaders going to Ukraine at this time. As I said, they've given Ukraine another false promise. This is another example of what Professor Mearsheimer spoke about when he discussed in a famous video that he made about how the offer of NATO membership to Ukraine was setting Ukraine on the primrose path to its own destruction. The leaders of the West have learnt nothing from that debacle. They've now made another promise to Ukraine, which they privately have no intention of honouring. They are treating Ukraine, in my opinion, incredibly badly, and they're doing something which is more likely to prolong the war than to end it. I really feel that these promises to Ukraine, which, as I said, will only provoke the Russians to even greater anger, and which will delude the Ukrainians into thinking that Western support is holding up for them when the reality is the opposite. I think this kind of behaviour is a further comment on the utter bankruptcy of diplomacy and policy in the West. Now, it's also clear that these three Western leaders used this trip to Ukraine with a particular ulterior purpose. They told Ukraine that yes, they all support its candidacy, its attempt to become a candidate to join the European Union. But it seems in private, they all pressed Ukraine to start negotiations immediately with the Russians to end the war, something that the Ukrainians have repeatedly said they do not want to do at this time. The reason the Ukrainians don't want to do it was explained by Zelensky's chief negotiator and national security advisor, David Arahamia, in an interview to Axios. He said that Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate with Russia because with Russia controlling 20% of Ukraine's territory, and with Russia gaining more territory by the day, Ukraine, if it sat down and negotiated with Russia now, would be in a very weak negotiating position. I've already made clear my own profound disagreement with this approach, but that's what the Ukrainians are saying. The Europeans went to Kiev in part to get the Ukrainians to shift ground on this, to reopen those negotiations. And of course, at the back of everybody's mind is the knowledge that because of Ukraine's weak position, if Ukraine were to enter into negotiations with Russia now, it would be forced into a negotiated settlement, if there was a real chance of ending the war, on far more unfavourable terms than those which were offered or which might have been agreed in Istanbul in March, had the discussions at that point been allowed to take their course. And that, of course, means very extensive territorial concessions, Ukraine losing some of its most valuable and productive territories, and effectively becoming what I suspect would be a client state of Russia. All three leaders know this, and I suspect that when they went to Kiev, they were essentially pushing Ukraine in that direction. Because, as we've discussed many times on the Duran, and as I've discussed many times on this channel, the reality is that the Europeans now are desperately feeling the heat of that disastrous economic war of attrition they launched against the Russians back in February, which has now backfired on them hideously. And we hear now that with the problems of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, problems which may be real or they may be rationalizations for the Russians to stop gas flows. Who's to say? I can't say. But we've now had an apocalyptic statement about what could happen from a senior German official. And I'm taking this from Remix. It's essentially a translation of an interview that this official, Klaus Müller, who is the head of Germany's Federal Network Agency, which is the regulatory office for electricity, gas, telecommunications, postal services, and railway markets. Anyway, this is what he has apparently said in an interview to the Rheinische Post newspaper in Germany. He said that a gas shortage and high prices will send shockwaves through the country, leading to landlords cutting the heat for tenants and widespread company bankruptcies. Now, I should say that a particular feature of Germany, of German residential system, is that in Germany, a very much higher proportion of the German population rent their homes than do so in some Western countries like, say, Britain and I believe the United States. It's much more common to rent in Germany than it is in certain other Western countries, and a very much higher proportion of the population does so. So if landlords cut heat for tenants, that's going to affect a very significant part of the German population indeed. Anyway, to continue, Müller paints a bleak picture about the crisis. He says that banks will ramp up their business and installment loans, and ailing companies will fall into bankruptcy. And he says he expects gas prices to continue to climb, resulting in increased inflation, which will go far beyond energy. He also apparently has warned that there is a dramatic lack of gas for the coming winter, and this could lead to landlords turning down heat to save on energy. Germans may have to grapple with colder apartments. And his explanation, he says that the account of this interview says that in a sign that the German government is operating under the assumption that a potential crisis could develop in winter, there are already talks about potentially lowering heating requirements for landlords. And Muller, and then there's a direct quote from him, Muller says, tenancy law stipulates that the landlord must adjust the heating system during the heating period so that the minimum temperature falls between 20 and 22 degrees Celsius. The government could temporarily lower the heating requirement for landlords. We are discussing this with politicians. And apparently there's already pressure on businesses and citizens to reduce energy consumption. That pressure may come in the form of new laws and regulations in the future. Muller is calling for more pressure to be applied to save gas. Germany has pushed, and then he says, if Russia were to cut gas in the critical winter months or even restrict supplies, it could lead to critical damage to the German economy. And he says that there will be mass bankruptcies. He says that government policies can help mitigate financial losses and preserve critical gas supplies. And he wants to establish mechanisms to reward companies that voluntarily give up gas quotas with a premium. It is always better for adjustments that are made via prices rather than direct state intervention. And then he goes on to say gas prices for private households have already multiplied compared to the pre-Ukraine war period. There can be a nasty surprise for tenants if high back payments are due, he said, referring to the fact that many Germans get surprise bills at the end of a billing cycle if energy prices rise. So, critical shortages in Germany, colder apartments for Germans, less gas used by Germany's energy-intensive industrial base, and inevitable government interventions in the German economy to try to keep gas, to control gas supply, and in effect kind of system of rationing, with of course the inevitable distortions that is going to create in the smooth functioning of the economy. And note that Muller doesn't seem to have any solution for the long term. He doesn't seem to be talking about one. I've already discussed in previous programs, we've discussed often on the Duran, all these ideas of importing liquefied natural gas from the United States, liquefied natural gas from Iran, pipeline gas from Azerbaijan. There's a new project, a new idea, a mirage in the Mediterranean to import natural gas from the East Mediterranean gas fields, which are fairly small and haven't even been developed yet, all of which would take decades to get up and running, even if it were to happen. Attempts also to obtain gas from Algeria. None of this can hope to replace Russian production in any effective time period. So Muller has no answer to this. The German government has no answer to this. Olaf Scholz must be looking at this, and he must be getting increasingly concerned. And that's why, of course, he's gone to Kiev and is now pressing the Ukrainians for negotiations. Mario Draghi, he's also seen gas supply to Italy start to fall. Italy is the biggest consumer of Russian gas in Europe after Germany. Italy has mounting problems. The higher interest rates are going to start putting pressure on Italian sovereign debt and by extension on the Italian banking system. Italy's looking in an increasingly precarious position. And as for Emmanuel Macron, he's now witnessed a French GDP contraction in the last quarter. So the pressure is on all three. And it's perhaps not surprising that with the war in Ukraine going badly, with the ability of the West to keep Ukraine supplied with weapon systems, frankly, exhausted, they're now trying to persuade the deeply reluctant and unhappy Ukrainians to engage in negotiations. Now, I've come back to what I've said many times. The Europeans may want the Ukrainians to negotiate. The Ukrainians may agree to negotiate. I absolutely think that is what the Ukrainians should sit down and do. Whether the Russians will agree at this point is an open question. Though I think from a Russian point of view, the prospects of their agreeing to it are significantly less than they would have been a few weeks ago. I don't think Ukraine has any choice. I don't think the Western powers have any realistic choice. It's a tragedy that they didn't understand this before the war began, when the negotiations were underway to try and resolve the problems in Europe, and which the Western powers refused to do. And it's also a tragedy that when there was a possibility of some kind of negotiated settlement being agreed in the talks in Istanbul in March, that opportunity was recklessly and foolishly thrown away. But there we are. I don't think there's any choice. I think the Ukrainians, in their own interests, need to put aside fantasies of successful counteroffensives and victories and sit down and negotiate with the Russians and come to and see what they can retrieve from that. And I think the Europeans really need to be more straightforward with Ukraine. They shouldn't dangle pointless promises of EU membership, which they don't really believe in. They shouldn't indulge themselves in that kind of folly. They should straightforwardly and openly say to Ukraine that the ability, the capacity of the Western powers to support Ukraine is now exhausted, and in its own interests, it needs to start talks with the Russians right away. I think in this kind of situation, when men are dying on the battlefield, when there is a looming economic crisis, not just in Europe, but across the West, it is the moral duty of leaders, real leaders, to face difficult truths, make the kind of decisions that need to be made, and for once be honest with their people. Well, I see no prospect of that. I'm afraid we're going to have this strange process of the Western powers saying one thing in private, another thing in public. The Ukrainians, who don't really want to talk to the Russians under any circumstances, feeling they're under no real pressure to do so. When they lose on the battlefield, they come scampering, demanding more weapons. The West gives a few dribs and drabs of weapons. I'm afraid this tragic farce, tragic because people are dying, farce because it is ultimately ridiculous and, to my mind, humiliating. I'm afraid that's going to continue until, frankly, there will probably be no Ukraine left. But there we are. I've made my views clear again in this program about what needs to be done. I wonder whether I'm skeptical about whether it will be. Well, whilst the Western powers are all over the place, whilst Ukraine indulges itself in its suicidal follies, the other great powers in the world are making their decisions, and they're doing so in far more coherent ways than we see in the West. Now, President Putin of Russia and President Xi Jinping of China had a telephone conversation on Wednesday. Now, I'm going to say straight away that telephone conversations between Putin and Xi happen on a very regular basis. I've heard it suggested by one person that they take place every week. Others, perhaps more plausibly, say that they speak to each other at least once a month. Mostly, though, these conversations are not reported. The Chinese and Russian governments do not publish readouts of what the two leaders said to each other. The one on Wednesday was different. And it's not coincidental, I think, that Wednesday apparently is Xi Jinping's 69th birthday. So he seems to have used his birthday, his way of celebrating his birthday, if it was indeed his birthday, was to telephone his good friend Vladimir Putin of Russia, and the two had a very interesting talk. Now, I'm going to read out the readouts that the two governments have provided. Let me first of all begin with the Russian one. And it begins like this. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, during which the two leaders had an in-depth exchange of views on a wide range of issues on the bilateral and international agendas. The president stated that Russian-Chinese relations were at an all-time high and are constantly improving. They reaffirmed their commitment to consistently deepen the comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction in all areas. The current state of and prospects for trade and economic cooperation, the volume of which is expected to reach record high levels in 2022, were reviewed in detail. It was agreed to expand cooperation in energy, finance, manufacturing, transport, and other areas, taking into account the global economic situation that has become more complicated due to the illegitimate sanctions policy pursued by the West. The further development of military and defense ties were touched upon as well. During the discussion of the situation in the international arena, it was emphasized that Russia and China, as before, have overlapping or very close positions, consistently uphold the fundamental principles of international law, seek to build a truly multipolar and fair system of international relations. The parties confirmed their mutual commitment to improve coordination and mutual support in various multilateral formats, including at the United Nations, the importance of cooperation within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS was underscored, in particular in the context of the upcoming BRICS summit to be hosted by the Chinese presidency on June 23rd, 24th. Vladimir Putin laid out his principled assessment of the situation in Ukraine and the tasks being tackled during the special military operation. The Chinese president noted the legitimacy, note that word, of Russia's actions to protect fundamental national interests in the face of challenges to its security created by external forces. It was agreed to continue bilateral contacts both at the heads of state level and through various ministries and agencies. The conversation was held in a traditionally warm and friendly atmosphere. Note that key word, legitimacy. So according to the Russians, Xi Jinping told Putin that the military operation, the Russian military operation in Ukraine is justified and legitimate. It is in accord with international law. Now, that's the strongest words of support for this military operation than the Chinese have given up to now. However, this is the Russian readout, and perhaps the Russians would want to give a positive spin on things. So let's see now what the Chinese have to say. And this is their readout of the same call. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday afternoon held a phone conversation with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. During their conversation, Xi noted that since the beginning of this year, bilateral relations have maintained a sound development momentum in the face of global turbulence and transformations. The economic and trade cooperation between the two countries has made steady progress, Xi said, adding that the Heihe-Blagoveshchensk cross-border highway bridge has opened to traffic. This is a huge new bridge linking China and Russia, creating a new channel connecting the two countries. The Chinese side stands ready to work with the Russian side to push for steady and long-term development of practical bilateral cooperation. China is willing to work with Russia to continue supporting each other on their respective core interests concerning sovereignty and security, as well as on their major concerns, deepening their strategic coordination and strengthening communication and coordination in such important international and regional organizations as the United Nations, the BRICS mechanism, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, up to this point, the two readouts are very similar indeed. They both praise their current cooperation. They say that cooperation is moving to a new level. They talk about how that cooperation is multifaceted, and they're going to develop it in economic ties. But note that Xi Jinping talks about each side supporting the other's respective core interests concerning sovereignty and security. He doesn't quite say, the Chinese readout doesn't quite say that the Chinese consider the Russian military operation in Ukraine legitimate, but it does signal a similar level of support. Ukraine is a core interest to Russia, and China therefore supports Russia's position there up to a point, or at least perhaps in private, just as China expects Russia's support on China's core interests, including, of course, Taiwan. Anyway, let's just continue with the Chinese readout. China is also willing to work with Russia to promote solidarity and cooperation among emerging market countries and developing nations, and push for the development of the international order and global governance towards a more just and reasonable direction. For his part, President Putin said the Russian side sincerely congratulates China on its remarkable development achievements under the strong leadership of Xi Jinping. Since the start of the year, the practical cooperation between Russia and China has been developing steadily, Putin said, adding that Russia supports the global security initiative proposed by the Chinese side and opposes any force to interfere with China's internal affairs using so-called issues regarding Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Taiwan, among others, as an excuse. So China supports Russia in its core interest, Ukraine. Russia supports China over Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Taiwan. Putin noted that Russia is ready to strengthen multilateral coordination with China so as to make constructive efforts in boosting multipolarization of the world and establishing a more just and reasonable international order. And now we come to the part of the readout, the Chinese readout, which explicitly refers to Ukraine. The two heads of state also exchanged views on the Ukraine issue. Xi emphasized that China has always independently assessed the situation on the basis of the historical context and merits of the issue, and actively promoted world peace and the stability of the global economic order. All parties should push for a proper settlement of the Ukraine crisis in a responsible manner, Xi said, adding that China, for this purpose, will continue to play its dual role. Now, there is a shift in the Chinese position, because Xi says that China independently assesses the situation. Independent of who? Well, of course, the United States. They're not going to be pressured by the United States. They've made their own assessment of the situation. And they're taking into account the historical context and merits of the issue. The merits of the issue are that there was repeated attempts to negotiate a compromise, the Minsk II agreements, and they were torpedoed, they were sabotaged, and the historical context, the whole history of Ukraine, the fact that it was part of the Soviet Union and before that of the Russian Empire, the position of the Russian population in Ukraine, the fact that all of these issues left over from the Soviet collapse have been unresolved, the meddling and interference of the West. And then Xi then goes on to say that the Chinese are also concerned about promoting world peace and the stability of the economic order. So world peace, in other words, no military steps by the Americans to aggravate the conflict in Ukraine, and the stability of the global economic order, well, it clearly refers to sanctions. And then he talks about all parties should push for a proper settlement of the Ukrainian crisis in a responsible manner, adding that China for this purpose will continue to play its due role. Now, that stops short of saying that the Chinese and the Ukrainians should sit down and negotiate with each other. It appears to say that, but it doesn't quite say it. So the Chinese seem to be saying, we understand what this is all about. We understand that this is for you a core issue. We grasp the merits of this issue, the merits of your case. We understand the historical context. We want to see this thing settled. We understand that it may not be settled through negotiations. So it's not quite saying, as the Russians claim, that this whole operation is legitimate, but it is recognizing and apparently quietly endorsing the Russian case. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians are talking about enhancing their cooperation, including their economic cooperation. Now, there's been much discussion recently about Chinese hesitancy to breach Western sanctions against Russia. Supposedly, the Chinese rejected suggestions that Russians issue union pay cards, Russian banks issue union pay cards, and supposedly also they are going to slow down in supplies of microprocessors and high technologies to Russia, because that would also breach Western sanctions. Now, on the union pay card issue, I think almost certainly this is something that the Russians are intensely relaxed about and probably agree with, because when that was first floated by some Russian banks, the concern was at that point that there would be a financial crisis in Russia, so they wanted this connection to China as a backstop. There's been no financial crisis in Russia. The Russian currency, the ruble, is extremely strong at the moment. The financial system in Russia is functioning normally, and more countries around the world are now accepting Russia's Mir card. At the moment, over the last few months, we've heard that Cuba, Iran, and Turkey are moving to accept the Russian Mir card. So I think the Russians and the Chinese probably agreed with each other that there was really no need to press forward with the union pay idea. That can wait until later. But on the high technology products and all of that, well, I think that most certainly the Chinese are continuing to provide the Russians with chips and all of those things. And I should say that Russia imports most of its chips from China, though it is, as I said, it produces many more chips than I think people know about, and is undoubtedly intent on enhancing its own chip production capabilities even further. But whatever problems and bottlenecks have existed up to now, I think there is a political will on the part of the Chinese and Russian leaderships to overcome them, and I expect that over the next couple of months we will see that happen. Now, that's exactly what happened during the previous round of anti-Russian sanctions in 2014. There was a period when the Chinese businesses, Chinese banks hesitated to continue with some of their long-standing economic relationships with the Russians, looking for guidance from Beijing about what they should do, and nervous about the impact of sanctions. Then the Chinese and the Russians got together at the political level, and gradually and purposefully these problems were then sorted out and trade resumed in ways which did not, in fact, lead to the Chinese becoming vulnerable to sanctions. And that's exactly what I suspect is going to happen. I mean, there'll be, I suspect, special companies, Chinese companies, set up to carry out trade with Russia. The Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund will no doubt be active. One way or the other, all sorts of things will be done to circumvent any sanctions problems. And besides, I think that the Chinese, the political leadership in China, seeing the deterioration of relations with the United States, expects sanctions pressure to mount on China anyway. So here we see China now coming out very clearly and strongly in support of Russia. Now, this is a conversation between Putin and Xi. Xi Jinping is now apparently going to address the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Personally, he's actually going to give an address to it, though this will be obviously done from a distance. It will be a virtual address, but that apparently is now what is coming. So there will be further expression of Chinese support, a public expression of Chinese support for cooperation with Russia, despite the sanctions pressure. Now, to my mind, what this means is that the sanctions war is ended. The West has lost. The Russians have already managed to pull through, and now the Chinese are reaffirming the fact that from their point of view, China and Russia are joined at the hip economically as well. So at this point, anybody who has any sense in the West should be saying, this has gone disastrously wrong. We're suffering appalling consequences. This is the moment where we call it off. Well, don't expect that. Don't hold your breath, but that is the reality. Well, more on Chinese-Russian relations from me and from us on the Duran soon. That's where we are at the moment, or so it seems to me. Thank you for joining me again today. Long video again, over 50 minutes. I'm going to stop now. Remember, you can find us on other channels, on other platforms, Locals and Rumble, Super U and Odyssey, Telegram and others. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. You can also go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, magic mugs, t-shirts, hats, hoodies and all the rest. And of course, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.